I met Ed because he was a client of my office. He was one of my partner's clients, and my partner introduced me to Ed because Ed had this idea of forming a foundation, a not-for-profit, and my expertise at that time was not-for-profits. So he brought Ed in, and we talked a little bit, and I said, Ed, you really need to talk to your attorney. And I think that's how John got involved, because his attorney at the time was also retiring, and he brought John into the picture at the same time, and we all met together to try to come to some kind of an idea as to what Ed really had in mind, and what, you know, what he really wanted this foundation to do. And
yeah, that's how I remember it. There was Larry Golbass of our office of Kernan & Kernan, was Ed's longstanding attorney for many, many years. And he was retiring, so he suggested that I take over. And I was a young lawyer. I was really 1 year out of law school or so. I really was very, very green. And he introduced me to Ed, and Ed was a sophisticated and experienced consumer of legal services. And he knew that I was very young lawyer in the firm, and he could have had his pick of who he wanted to be his lawyer, but he went with me anyway, and it turned out to be a great, long-standing relationship. But I was always impressed with how patient he was and tolerant, and he never complained that he should have been with a senior partner or a higher level lawyer. We hit it off from the beginning, and he was most gracious about it.
I was in the same firm with John, and I met Ed 48 years ago. He was introduced to me by the same lawyer that John mentions, Larry Golbass. I was 2 years out of law school at the time, but I didn't know anything. But one thing that Larry wanted me to know about Ed was that you are never going to be with him for a long time. When he sets up an appointment, he's on time, be there. Expect that he's going to come prepared to discuss what it is he would like done. And when he's done, he'll get up and leave and shake your hand. He was not a time waster.
He always
very pleasant.
He always had that little list that could be on the back of an envelope, but he had his list, and he'd come in and he'd have that list, and Ed was meticulous. He wrote everything like it had been typed, and he'd start with the list. And Greg's right. If he had an 8 o'clock appointment, he got there at 8 o'clock. We used to swear that he used to wait into his car until 8 o'clock. But he got in, he'd sit down, and there was no room for chit chat. He started off with his list, and he meticulously crossed it off until he got through everything. And he says, "Is that it?" And we say, "Yep." And he'd say, "See you tomorrow." Or see you next time. He was very, very direct, and he knew what he wanted to do. He didn't have time to waste.
I think he respected the lawyer's time, because that's all the lawyer has to sell. He didn't want to waste your time. He came to the office ready to go. Same with Fred, I'm sure with John.
He always wanted a morning appointment, at least when I was doing work for him, because he had so many activities scheduled in the afternoon. Most of them were sports and Whitesboro related and volunteering, and he had a checklist of things that he had to do in the morning because he had more important things in his mind in the afternoon that he had to get to. My first impression of Ed, I couldn't figure him out. He was one of the most unique individuals I'd ever met in my life. I couldn't put him in a category. It took me quite a while to really understand who he was, in a good way. I mean, I don't say that in a negative way. He just was a very unique individual. I don't know how you guys felt about it when you...
I agree. My first impression was, well, here's a man that wants something done, and he wants you to do it the right way. He wants you to finish it, get back to him, bill him. He always wanted his bill right after the appointment, which I give him credit for. And he always paid his bill usually the same day. The check would be written the same day and would come to the office. So he was very, very dignified, very businesslike, and just a wonderful person to deal with.
Yeah, my first memories of Ed were similar. He was, of all the clients I've had in my career, Ed had the most meticulous records I had ever seen. And he always wanted to make things as easy as they possibly could be for you. But he also, if he had a question, he'd make sure he pointed it out to you and said, hey, listen, I'm not sure of this, but could you check it out? But I always suspected he knew the answer before he asked, but he always asked and he gave you the ability to discuss it with him. But, he was just an easy person to talk to.
Well, I remember being in his yard more than once, and I remember seeing his garden. He had a vegetable garden and a few flowers. The garden was huge, and he rented a spot behind the neighbor's house. I suspect he probably provided vegetables to his neighbor as a result of that. His fruit trees, blueberries, raspberries. And later in life, when he had had a stroke and was disabled, I was with Fred involved in clearing out his home. And you could tell from the things that he owned how independent he was of everybody else. The basement was full of equipment for canning and putting things in jars, and I suspected that he probably sustained himself pretty much. He was a self-made person at home with his brother. He lived with his brother, and there were no other people in the house. So what I remember about him most is that he was very independent.
When you talk about that, one of my biggest memories of Ed also is telling me his story. Because when, Ed basically was born, and except for the time he ended up in an assisted care living, he was born and lived in the same house his entire life. And him and his brother, when they were younger, they used to make sandwiches, and they used to cook soups, and they used to make coffee, and they used to go to all the knitting mills that we used to have in the area, and that's how they used to make a living. And I said, well, but Ed, how did you get from there to here? And he said, one day when I was delivering food, there was a gentleman who came up to me and basically disrespected me. He said I was just nothing more than just a sandwich maker, and I'd never amount to anything. And he said that bothered me. It bothered me a lot. And he made a decision on that day to buy the Wall Street Journal. And he used to read the Wall Street Journal from front to back every single day. And it was from that time that he basically went from making sandwiches to buying real estate to becoming an investor, and basically doing it all on his own. Ed had an opinion on everything, but he never told you what it is. What it was. Ed, he did everything on his own, and I again, a story like that is just wonderful to hear. But he was really motivated by that person who made him feel like he was nothing.
My most vivid recollection, or that captures Ed, I think, was going back to Larry Golbas, the lawyer who passed him on. He would stop in the office from time to time after I was doing work for Ed, and he would stick his head in his office, and he'd say, how's my friend Ed? And I'd say, oh, good. He said, and Larry would say, did you get into the strawberry patch yet? Or the raspberry patch? And I said, no, not yet. He said, no, you will. Just hang in there, hang in there. So after a few years, I get a call about 5 o'clock. It's Ed. I'm right in the office. He says, John, I have a slot tonight for raspberry picking. It's about 6 o'clock. You can come over, and you can bring the kids if you want. This was like a big deal to be invited over to his house and to his raspberry patch. So I ran home, changed my clothes. A hot summer night, got my 2 kids there, about 3 and 5, and we drove over with my wife. And there was Ed sitting on the back step. He was just covered in dirt. He'd been gardening. and he had a giant bowl of vanilla ice cream filled with berries. And he was sitting there eating the ice cream. And got there with my kids, and he said, my little daughter, would you like to get some raspberries? And she said yes. And he got up and he had a little special knife and he took her by the hand into this unbelievable raspberry patch. I mean, it was something out of the movies. And he took her in and he showed her how to pick the right one and how to cut it. And of course, she ate more than she picked. My son ate more than he picked. And he was just in his glory, sharing his raspberry patch with children. And we had little buckets and we filled them up. And then he took me aside and he said, can they have some ice cream? Have they had their dinner yet? And of course they hadn't, but how could I say no? So they had a little ice cream and he put raspberries on it for them. And he was just in such a good mood. He was so joyful and just beaming by being able to share with children. And that stands out to me as probably the most vivid memory of all the things that I experienced with Ed. It was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. If there's one thing I would want to pass on to athletes, young athletes today, that they could take from being around Ed Wadas, and that would be to just be a class act, to be a gentleman, to be a good sportsman, to play fair, to help out, to be a good teammate. I think that was something that was very important to him, and that's how he lived his life.
I would agree with what John says. In addition to that, I guess I would always be on time for practice, and because he would be there for practice. And if you needed something, don't be afraid to ask your coach or your adult, and treat your referees properly.
The one thing that I would tell a youth in participating in sport to remember about Ed is Ed always thought that the person that never played was as important as the star. Ed always thought that anybody on the team, anybody that showed up for practice was just as valuable. And, Ed had it actually goes back to Ed's story as to how I think this is how he got involved with athletics. When Ed was growing up, and help me here, John, if I get a little astray, but when Ed was growing up, there was a situation where the team was practicing and they would hit the ball into an elder woman's yard. Well, this woman only spoke Polish, and she was, the way Ed used to describe it, she was not a polite person. She was very mean, so nobody would go near her. So at the end, practice ended when they ran out of balls because no one would go and get the ball. Ed was the only one there that spoke Polish. And the manager, the coach at the time said to Ed, can you talk to her? And Ed walked up to her and talked to her and was gone for what, 10 minutes, talking with her and schmoozing. He came out with a bucket of balls, okay? And from that time on, Ed was the manager. And I think that's what got him started.
Yeah. It's the same story he told me independently of you. I heard it because I had asked him. Same thing. It's just classic. And then, of course, he became scorekeeper, and he would clean the floor at the basketball games, and he was a track volunteer and a track starter, and he did the announcing of football games in the press box. I mean, he just did every supporting role as a volunteer that he could to help out, particularly Whitesboro athletes.
It's kind of funny you say that, because when he used to make appointments with us, he always wanted early appointments. But if he couldn't make an appointment in the morning, he used to go pull out his calendar, and it was like you were talking to the president. Oh, I can't do that because we got girls soccer. You can't do this, and it was almost impossible for us to get an appointment with him.
And you couldn't get him to come away from that. He would not.
No.
He would always put the sports volunteering ahead of his own personal business.
No, there's no doubt about that.
Costing him money. If you said, well, we'd have to delay the closing because of this, he didn't care, even if it meant that he was going to lose money. He had to be at that sporting event, and that was the priority for him.
One word that I would use to describe Ed would be very private, very private. In fact, as I was thinking about today, I wondered what he would think of the three of us talking about his life. Because his life for him was very private. And to follow along with what Fred said, the story about Ed getting involved as a team manager, I believe when he was in middle school.
Yeah.
Later in life, when he set up the foundation and he began to award scholarships, he had that in mind. The bench warmer, the manager, whoever was behind the scenes on the team would be the person that he would most like to have the scholarship.
But at the same time, he got a great deal of enjoyment out of enhancing experiences. But I think to just touch on what Fred said, he really understood the value of youth sports and the lessons that were taught, and how it kept kids out of trouble and it gave kids a place to go and put them in touch with good quality people. And it was far more than who scored the most touchdowns or home runs. For him, it was all about life lessons and what sports could teach. I think that was really down at the core of what he was all about.
And I just adding to what they've said as far as why I think Ed chose this as the mission. I think his generous heart was what propelled him into the thought of making sure that youth sports, boys and girls, first with Whitesboro, then Oriskany, then New York Mills, and then the counties. He just was full of generosity and full of a need to be in their midst to help them develop. That's how I feel about it.
When we were at the raspberry picking session, as we were leaving, I noticed he had just a beautiful blueberry patch that was all enclosed with this netting to keep birds off. It was just spectacular. And I had a blueberry patch growing up, so I was very impressed with it. And we were walking towards the car, and I said, "Boy, that's quite a nice blueberry patch you got there. What do I got to do to get in there?" He said, "Oh, you're not ready. You're not ready." That was like the next level of relationship with him. And he was didn't hesitate at all to tell me that I wasn't there yet. It was kind of a funny way, but it struck me as so true about it. Unfortunately, I didn't. He became ill and wasn't able to continue.
Yeah, my funny story is two actually. One is the same story he told, except that he didn't say you're not ready yet. He said they're not ready yet. The blueberries. So we're done. And the other one was when he was inducted into the Sports Hall of Fame, and Fred dragged him there. Well, physically, I'm not sure, but almost. He just sat there looking at people. People would come up and say, "Congratulations." Oh, he didn't know what to say. He was just, his personality wouldn't allow him to receive a compliment.
I'll tell you what he said. He said, "When can we leave?"
Yeah, that's right. That's true. Yeah. When is this going to be
very?
over?
He's just very uncomfortable. It wasn't him. I have a couple stories. One story involves John and I. When John and I were, along with Ed, were the original foundation board members, and we used to meet at my office. And one of our earlier meetings, Ed came. It was like an 8:00 meeting. He come walking in, and Ed had these 2 plastic bags. And he walked in and he put the 2 plastic bags on a chair, and he brought out his note and we went through everything. And he looked at us. He says, "Are we done?" And we says, "Yes." He says, "Wait." So he went over to the chair and he grabbed these 2 plastic bags and he gave one to John and he gave one to me. And we open them up. He says, "Look." And we look in there, and inside the plastic bags were Band-Aids, Pepto-Bismol, Tylenol, other medications. And I looked at John and I'm like, and he looks at me, he said, "Well, if you're going to work with me, you're going to need this." Okay? So that's one. The other memory is it's when Ed was in the assisted care, if he needed any medical help, I used to drive him, and he developed pneumonia one time, and he ended up going to Faxton Hospital, and I went down and I met him there because we went by ambulance, and I got there, and we sat there, and while we were there, I had a couple people come up to me and they said, "Is that Uncle Ed?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "That guy's a hero. I know Uncle Ed." And I swear we went into the room to be seen by the physician, and someone walks in and says, "Is that Uncle Ed?" And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, "Ed, are you a rock star or what?" I couldn't believe, but that was every time we went someplace, somebody called him Uncle Ed.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Greg.
I like to add to that. When Ed was in assisted living, he was independent, but he had aphasia, so he couldn't really speak. You never could tell if he understood yes and no, even. But he always had his powder blue sweater on whenever I would see him. And one day when I went up to see him, and we left his room and went down the hallway, there were a number of elderly ladies nearby who were cluttered by the elevator, and pushed the button. And as we rounded the corner, they all said, "Oh, hi, Ed. Oh, Ed, you're coming to dinner." And Ed just said, "Oh, yes." And the elevator door opened, and of course, Ed stepped back, and they all got on the elevator, and they held the door for him. Said, "Come on in, Ed. Come on in, Ed. You're going to ride down with us." And he looked at me like, these ladies want me to be with them. And I never understood what was going through his head. But I stepped back and went down the stairs, and he ended up going down with about half a dozen ladies. But he seemed to be involved with whoever lived there, but especially those ladies that I saw that day.
To finish up on your story, though, actually what he used to say is that every time a new woman would come into the assisted care facility, he used to tell me, "That's another chair I got to push in." It was a big thing for him at dinner time. He would push all the women's chairs in. That was his role.
I'll just add to that another funny story about that. I went to see him at the nursing home, and again, as Greg said, he couldn't speak. But the rumor was that all the women in the facility just adored him because he was such a gentleman. And I said, I heard you have I said to Ed, "I heard you have a girlfriend here." And he shook his head no, and he went like this. He had 3 girlfriends.
I'm sure he was seated at dinner with all of them.
Yeah. I had one thing that I thought was important to finish up about Ed. That his generosity extended beyond sports and children and student athletes. He was very generous in his private life with people. He was very generous with the Polish community and people that he knew through his family relations. I did a lot of legal work for people in the Polish community that Ed would pay for. He would take me to their house, introduce me. I would write wills and do various things. And then Ed, when we would leave, Ed would speak to them in Polish and sort of translate. And then we would leave. Ed would say, "Send me the bill." And there were a number of occasions where he came in to see me, where he was loaning money to people who were in desperate straits. They were in over their head with credit card debt. And they were usually somehow connected to the school. They were coaches or referees. And he would loan them money so that they could pay off their credit card debt. But as a lawyer, I would say to him, "Ed, there's no way you're going to get this paid back. I've looked at their financials. They're not going to get paid. You're not going to get paid back." And I'd say, well, why don't we put a mortgage on or, do something with security? He'd say, no. Just have them sign a piece of paper. And I don't want to be there. You take care of it. I don't want to be there. And then he said, "The only thing I want is when they come in, I want them to bring all the credit cards in, and I want you to cut them up." And then I would have the people come in, and we would pay off all of their credit card debt, cut up the credit cards in front of them, and they'd leave. And as far as I know, they never got paid. And we're talking very large sums of money that he would pay off for these people that were in difficulty. And they would be crying in my office in the conference room when the transaction took place. And he wouldn't even be there. He just wanted it done. And then he would pay me to do it. So his generosity extended in many, many different ways.
No one ever knew of the things he used to do. I mean, there's things today that I wouldn't tell people that he did because I don't think it's my role to do so. But he never wanted people to know it was him. Never.